Good morning, everybody. I hope you're doing well. So briefly, if you weren't here yesterday, we spent a lot of time not only talking about data, but we also had a chance to find a consensus, thanks to Swarm AI, among us regarding some new ideas related to data governance. And again, we're going to try to do that again today around 2. So I hope you can stick around, but we also very much understand people have to get back to New York or Germany or wherever. So in any case, I would like to introduce our Vice Provost for Research, Dr. Pamela Norris, who's going to welcome us today, and we're grateful to have her.
Good morning and welcome to GW. Really nice to have you here. I'm thrilled that GW is hosting this important conversation on data governance. We all understand that AI systems could have great benefits for society. And we also intuitively know that these technologies come with some caveats and potential downsides. In our haste to implement promising AI tools, conversations like this are absolutely critical. We owe this to the next generation to make sure that questions of equity, ownership, privacy, bias, and accuracy and trust are fully vetted by the broadest coalitions possible, coalitions like this. GW is a hotbed of AI research and scholarship. Our investigators are developing applications for AI. We're also evaluating and mitigating the impacts of AI on society. We have programs that are tailored to train the next generation of professionals to design trustworthy AI systems. And we regularly convene conversations like this one. Just last week, GW hosted the 5th edition of the Athens Roundtable on AI and the Rule of Law, a 2-day conference that brought together members, a global community of researchers, industry, and policy, leading multiple members of the US Congress to explore topics of ethical AI development and governance. Our leadership in this area is a natural fit. It grew from our historic strengths in law, policy, and international affairs, our subject matter expertise in engineering and computer science, our broad community of scholars in the humanities and social sciences, and our proximity to the policymakers that are seeking advice, proposing rules, and drafting legislation. Our scholars have adopted a public interest technology approach to their work. At its core, this approach centers the public good in the evaluation and assessment of technological advances. GW is a proud member of the Public Interest Technology University Network, a coalition of more than 60 academic institutions that is dedicated to growing this new interdisciplinary field. Multiple GW-led projects under the umbrella of public interest technology are advancing relevant conversations, including the Ethical Trust Initiative and GW Coders, which provides opportunities for students from underrepresented populations to get involved in coding and data analytics projects. The Institute for Trustworthy AI in Law and Society, or NIST NSF Trails, is a $20 million initiative funded by NIST and NSF and co-led by GW, the University of Maryland, and Morgan State University. We are so proud to be part of this project. Trails is leading initiatives to promote trust and mitigate risk while simultaneously empowering and educating the public. Trails is just one of GW's cross-disciplinary institutes that is addressing the impacts of engineering technologies on society. In another project, a GW law professor has spearheaded an online searchable database of AI legislation to help lawyers, scholars, journalists, and others stay informed about emerging legal questions in the field. This year, GW funded a university-wide seminar series on AI and the humanities, a cross-disciplinary exploration of AI's impact centered on the contributions of humanists and what the contributions they can make as society grapples with this technology. And as I alluded to earlier, GW is also home to an NSF-funded traineeship program in designing trustworthy AI systems. The program leverages faculty from engineering and computer science who support PhD students, and they've also developed a graduate certificate program for mid-career professionals and host boot camps and seminars for the GW community. These are just a few examples of the impactful efforts underway at GW. Yesterday, I know you discussed a number of facets of large language models, open versus closed models, issues of enforcement around personal data, and gaps in governance. And I understand today you'll focus on new ideas to engage policymakers to help them see that data governance is an important means of governing AI. Speaking on behalf of GW, we know we can't address these huge questions alone. The organizations you represent are critical partners in the AI governance solution. And beyond today's event, we are actively seeking ways to engage other academics as well as policymakers and practitioners. So in that spirit, I want to extend an invitation to all of you to join us. Whatever your focus is, in large language models, AI, governance, there's likely a member of the GW community that is eager to share their expertise and to collaborate with you. Please contact me directly if I can help facilitate those connections. Thank you once again for convening this important conversation. Thank you, Susan. Thank you all for being here today, and welcome to GW.
Okay, we're going to start with our first panel of the day. So Divyansh, I'm going to invite you to come up. And our panelists as well. And so Divyansh is, he is the Associate Director for Emerging Technology at the Federation of American Scientists. He is going to introduce our panelists, who are going to present 3 different perspectives on what governments are doing. You want to stand here? Okay.
Wherever works.
Okay, great.
This works. Can you hear me all? Thanks, Susan, for having us here. I think this is a great topic, and we've got a really diverse panel here with representatives from the U.S. government, the German Chancellery, and the European Union. As Susan mentioned, I'm Divyansh. Kaushik. I handle emerging tech and national security policy at the Federation of American Scientists, which has been quite, very quiet these days. There's not much going on, but we'll try to do justice to this panel either way. So I'd love for the panelists to just take a minute to give a quick introduction for one, what they do in their relevant positions, and how does that relate to the topic that we are discussing. So, do you want to start?
Well, hi everyone, and thanks for the invitation. My name is Schönstein. I'm head of general digital policy at the German Federal Chancellery. My role is that I coordinate digital policies across the federal government. So that includes both our data strategy and our AI strategy. And on a good day, I sometimes also function as a conduit to the European level from time.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Gabrielle Mazzini. I'm a team leader for the AI Act at the European Commission. So I've been working basically on the AI Act since the beginning. Been in my department now for about 6 years, 5 years, 6 years. So I should have probably been in Brussels today. When I left yesterday, it wasn't planned to have a second meeting today. So which then when I left, I didn't know, but here I am. So probably you can benefit from my presence here, and my colleagues will hopefully miss me in Brussels.
Hi, good morning. I'm Chaitanya. I'm not representing the US government. I'm from NSF, so I think I'm representing some viewpoints from NSF. I'm actually a senior advisor in a new directorate at NSF called the Technology, Innovation and Partnerships Directorate, which was formed as part of the Chips and Science Act, which was passed on August 9th, 2022. We just finished our first year anniversary. It has been a very busy year for us, and topics like this are definitely relevant to the TIP directorate. I think part of the reason, one of the perspectives probably I can provide here is the fact that as representative of the TIP directorate, I sit on a number of working groups within NSF, and we'll talk a little bit about what we're doing, which relate to this topic.
As you can see, it's a stellar panel, and we'll try. But I want to start with the so TIP was established as part of Chips and Science. You've been doing a lot of great work, obviously. Could you also share a bit more about how, say, NSF and the directorates within NSF, including TIP, how are they encouraging shared data sets as well as, say, more accurate and complete or representative data sets, say, whether it's through the NAIR, which the White House just, you all just announced a pilot as after the executive order, or through other mechanisms? If you could elaborate on that.
Yeah, sure. So there are a couple of things there which are directly relevant. So there is the whole area of open science, which is across government, and there's the so-called Nelson memo, if you can look it up, that talked about the need for opening scientific data and making it publicly accessible. There's been a lot of activity across government agencies, and that there's actually a openscience.gov website. I don't know the exact URL, but you can find it. We have one of the several working groups on at NSF. One is called Public Access and Open Science Working Group. So that group has been actively considering various policies that we want to put in place to enact this need for open science. And one of the things that I think you'll see, I should be careful to, these are things that are upcoming and they may be coming out pretty quickly. NSF for a while has had something called the DMP, Data Management Plan. Those of you who do NSF awards or proposals are probably familiar. That's going to be extended, the scope of that, to emphasize the sharing of data. And actually one of the requirements we expect will be quite immediate sharing of the data. Currently, the data management plan at NSF requires that any publication that you put out has to be put in a public repository. There'll be a similar requirement for data. And not only that, we are looking to see how to close that loop so that we ensure that the data is put out there. So maybe one way is when folks come back for another award, that's an opportunity for us to see. But we are also looking at more proactive ways in which that would all be done. So that's one that's going to be coming out. And let's see, in open science, another project actually that's from the TIP directorate is something called the Open Knowledge Network. So if you look for the prototype Open Knowledge Network, which we call Proto-OKN, that's a project that has just started, funded 18 projects. And what they're doing is each project is working with some government agency or the other, one or more government agencies, with the idea, again, of opening up government data, but also integrating heterogeneous data and using these technologies of knowledge graphs and so on. And as you can imagine, LLMs have come on very fast. So there's a whole discussion of what is the interplay between things like LLMs and structured knowledge bases. I think yesterday you heard someone talk about retrieval enhanced, lookup enhanced retrieval, and so on. So I think that's going to be a rich area, I think. And yesterday we also heard about the small language models. So I think there's going to be a whole area. It's going to be really exciting, I think, of just looking at a variety of different models, and many of which will in fact connect to trusted and trustworthy data sources so that they're actually giving you a capability which is, much better than what the LLMs do today.
That's incredible. Michael, I want to come to you. Like, can you talk about Germany's data strategy roadmap for the audience here?
Yes. So we had a second edition of our federal data strategy this summer. This follows on the first one from 2020, and of course you may wonder why do you need to do a new one so quickly? I think that the truth is we needed a political moment for a new coalition. This is one part. The other part, though, is that we realized we had a nice strategy before, but implementation was lacking, and I think we really saw the need for another push there, and of course that's then also been helped by the let's say public perception, strong public perception of foundation models, LLMs being scaled. So the ChatGPT moment, if you like. We're looking at three areas broadly in this data strategy: more data, so making data available both from public and private sources. Better data, investing a lot in quality of data sets. Also, for example, government-wide initiative for standards on data labeling, also data labeling by design. And then finally, also a question, I would say, around the actual use of data, which is more something that we consider a cultural issue, where we need to foster a culture of actually starting projects by looking at data rather than something else, especially in the public sector. And this is underpinned by a roadmap that combines both legislative action and non-legislative. And on the legislative side, what's important for us is particularly that we start in the first pillar with a review of the basic legislative framework for data use. That is the Federal Data Protection Law, which partly implements the European GDPR, but also designates procedures in the interplay between authorities and agencies that actually enforce data protection. There we have a big issue, and this was one of the key implementation problems that we had before, that more than half of companies in Germany say they don't so much have a problem with the law when it comes to data protection. They have a problem with getting different, at times opposing opinions on the interpretation of the law from different agencies. And so this is something that's very important for us to work on. The other area that's also in this pillar of very basic legislative points that feeds directly in the use of artificial intelligence is an employee data protection legislation. This is one of the opening clauses of the GDPR. So national states can have such a legislation, and we want to really clarify what data use is actually allowed and what is not allowed, and how exactly participation of workers in the design and the co-design of especially AI applications that use data that's generated in the workplace can work. Building on that, we have a couple of sectoral initiatives, and I think one of them actually matches very much to what Bara has been just saying. The federal research data legislation that I would say is pretty exactly what we just heard here, so I don't need to repeat that. But we're also looking at very similar initiatives. The first one is actually on health data, where we're changing a lot of the possibilities to collect data through opt-out rather than opt-in clauses for patients. Data is then made available in also government-funded data spaces, mostly for research, but not just medical research, also health infrastructure research. So where do you put a hospital? How do you co-design, or how do you steer medical capacities and so forth? And then we also look at mobility data, which is a third area. So other than research, mobility, and health are the sectoral deep dives, if you like. And finally, we try on the culture part to be better ourselves and inspire the rest through that by extending the use of the data labs that we set up in every federal ministry and their work. So we mandated that. every federal level ministry needs to have a data lab in the hopes that once you put it there, they're going to do something. And try and foster a culture that moves a bit away from our traditionally, well, I would say, quasi-religious interpretation of the coalition treaty as a source of policymaking towards a slightly more empirical source of orientation there. So that's broadly what we're looking at with our roadmap.
Wow, that's quite a lot.
Well,
I want to come to the EU here, Mr. Mazzini. Like, can you talk about like the data governance provisions in the AI Act, knowing it's not final yet, but what exists and what are you most excited about? Perhaps, especially as they relate to generative AI, but AI in general.
Yeah, sure. Of course, indeed, what I can talk about is just the proposal for the Commission for the time being. So don't take anything I'm saying as a part of what is being discussed. So perhaps just as a primary consideration, the AI Act in the proposal did not cover explicitly, I would say, generative AI. At least to the extent, well, I'd say there's been a lot of criticism, some criticism, let's say, to the Commission for not including generative AI in the proposal, as if we missed that boat. As the representative of the Commission, I also have to say this is only partially true, in the sense that for two reasons. So first, we had the definition of AI, which was largely inspired by the OECD definition, but we made some changes to that definition because, of course, the OECD definition, the principle was done more for policy, more general policy reasons, was not done for the legal text. So we needed to make some changes, and we made two changes at least. One is to say one of the outputs of AI system is also content. If you took the definition of OECD in 2019, there was no reference to content. So we did that specifically to include generative AI. And the second one was to add an annex, but okay, that's perhaps a different story. But the second provision that we also had in the original proposal was Article 52. Article 52 relates to the transparency provisions. And there you have a specific indication about systems that generate content. That was only limited to audio, video, and sound. It didn't include text. That was also intentional because the obligation there was essentially to say, in case of generated content that can basically lead to some sort of deceptions for individuals, we need to make sure that the user labels the content as artificially generated. Of course, when it comes to text, this is much more nuanced, so it's much more difficult to say. So just as a preliminary discussion about the fact that I think the Commission didn't fully forget generative AI. It was certainly part of our thinking, but it was certainly also pre-ChatGPT, as I'm just saying now. So with ChatGPT, the question became much more important politically, and you can see that emerging in the debate. So the Council general approach, which came out in 2022, in December 2022, had the new chapter around general purpose AI systems. And the Parliament position also had a complete new article on foundation models. So the question around generative AI became in the political debate much more relevant. So, but coming back to your question on the data. So the AI Act focuses, I would say, 95% of its provisions on high-risk AI systems. All the provisions there are basically the ones that are really compulsory and relate to high-risk AI systems only. So including the data governance. We have a specific article on data governance, Article 10, which is one of the 5 requirements for high-risk AI systems. From our perspective, in order for systems to be trustworthy, and we didn't invent anything here, they need to comply with 5 requirements and subject to ex-ante conformity assessment. These 5 requirements relate to data, to technical documentation, human oversight, I have it here, I forgot, transparency, and the last one is cybersecurity, accuracy, and robustness. So when it comes to data, therefore, we require that all high-risk AI systems are subject to appropriate data governance practices, and these include issues around the design choices, data collection, data preparation processing, the assumptions around why you choose certain data rather than not. Of course, assessment about availability of data, examination of possible bias, and possible data gaps. So there is also some other details, which, but I think it's interesting for you also to understand a bit the logic of why the provision on Article 10, which is actually one of the most, I would say, compared to the other requirements, quite extensive. But this is not the end of the story. So the AI Act is, the logic of the Act is that of what we called NLF, or New Legislative Framework Approach. What does it mean? It means that the basic legislation identifies essential, what we call essential requirements. These are binding requirements that providers of AI systems have to comply with. But we don't enter into the technical details about how to meet those requirements. This is part of the work that is undergoing with the European standardization organizations. Therefore, we actually have already given mandate as a commission. When you have this type of legislation called NLF, so the commission gives a mandate to the European standardization organization to develop standards that will implement on a technical level the requirements of the law. So this work is ongoing, and we expect this to be finalized by the time the AI Act will be applicable, not the time it enters into force. Because that's really going to be one of the privileged ways by which companies can demonstrate compliance.
That's awesome. I actually want to keep going on that thread. Given you mentioned there's the second meeting going on today in Brussels, and while we have you here, I think it would be professional malpractice for me to not ask the question. Can you talk about the barriers, essentially, to the AI sector within the 27 countries of Europe, and how that might or is affecting EU-wide and national AI governance, especially like as the negotiations are going on?
Just say something. Chatham House rules.
Yes.
So if that's okay,
Is there anyone on Zoom?
everyone knows what that means. So,
We can tweet, but we can't say who said it.
Yes.
There are not many people from the EU here.
Yes.
you could say something very vague, like there was in the passive voice, there was a discussion about what is holding up the AI Act. And you cannot attribute it to anybody. But the problem with that is, of course,
You can attribute it to me. Anything objectionable said, you can attribute that to me.
what's heard in this room should generally stay.
Great.
Yeah. Your question. I think it's a bit of a composite question. I mean, on the one hand, of course, state of play. On the other hand, the sort of the barriers sort of in the 27 member states. I would say, as regards the second point, the Act is a fairly anticipatory regulation. So when we started reflecting about it, and if you also look the impact assessment, which is a document that the Commission prepares before actually putting forward the proposal, which is possible. I mean, the treaty allows us to harmonize legislation also when there is a risk of fragmentation. Not only when there is fragmentation, also when there is a risk of fragmentation. So this, in that sense, is a bit anticipatory in the sense that already in 2021, there, to my knowledge, at least, I don't know what you think, Nicole, there weren't in the member states attempts to legislate, or maybe certainly we're not advanced, certainly we're not to the point of also about to happen. And so, but we felt that, of course, some policy issues were emerging, and therefore it would be appropriate to come up with a comprehensive EU regulation before that. And I don't think that this has been necessarily a problem in the negotiations. So the fact that you have proposed this because, and so I would not say that whatever comes out of these negotiations today or the next days, I don't know, one of the roadblock you could say is because the member states do not accept the fact that there would be a comprehensive EU regulation. I don't think this is the problem. I think it's more the content of that regulation, whether that is appropriate or not appropriate. But I don't think that there is any member states putting into question the fact that there should not be an EU level regulation of AI. This is something I've never. Maybe you.
I can just give.
Yeah, absolutely.
Perspective. I think on the legislation, what I can is we did have AI legislation before, but it was very specific. My previous job was coordinating the German AI strategy, and that dates back to 2018. And in 2019, we legislated a very specific piece of AI legislation regarding co-determination. So this is corporate governance. And I don't know how familiar you are with the German corporate governance structures, but there's an important role for works councils that represent workers in decision-making, strategic decision-making at the firm level from a certain firm size onwards. That is mandatory. And this co-decision-making or co-determination applies to every information technology project that can potentially be used to track workers' performance and or evaluate it. And so, of course, what we did is we clarified that very explicitly that too, of course, comprised applications of artificial intelligence or AI-based applications. So that we already did because we saw that as one of the key transmission mechanisms actually in the spread of AI. But that was just a very specific one. What I do think we had as a discussion very strongly because this is perhaps also a bit of an exception, but in Germany, it's the labor ministry that is responsible for product safety. So we were, in the whole NLF discussion. I think what was a bit a question mark that I would say to this day is not entirely resolved for me personally is how we come from a tradition of sector-specific, technology-neutral regulation that's very vertical to a horizontal approach that's technology-specific. In other words, the complete opposite of what the NLF has actually been designed for. And I think that's it makes sense from the point of view of the technology. I think that's just yes obvious. Oh no, of course no resistance at any point. But when we look a bit ahead to a time when we have an AI Act and it's about implementing it, I think this will be a very significant challenge for enforcement because the agencies that we have in the space of product safety that will have to take on a lot of the implementation are not built for the logic of the type of legislation that we're creating. They're built for something else, and I think that's going to, in the first instance, if it goes really well, it's going to be a temporary gap. But I think we will have skills and a competence and a capacity gap in our enforcement structures. That'll be a big issue, and then for us, this has been a concern, but this is also both a domestic and a European concern, I think, where we need to look at, what could be a European structure for enforcement that works together with the national structures where those problems that I just mentioned, I think are going to hit hardest.
Right. Well, if you would like to add anything else, or I'm happy to let you off the hook. But no, this is great. And I think, Mike, just to stay with you for a minute, you laid out how Germany has been approaching all these issues for a long time. And given the progressive stance you have on data, could you outline the measures the Chancellery has taken and plans to take to address present day harms around, whether they are around addressing bias and representation, and what initiatives are you enacting at the national level to address generative AI?
We do have a section specifically on LLMs in the data strategy that focuses though on the use in government. And the reason we did that is that we were in this moment where we don't yet have a finalized AI Act or a Data Act that we shouldn't forget about. And at that time also still a not finished evaluation of the GDPR. So we had to focus very much on what we could actually move at the national level, and this was that. That said, I think what's clear is that transparency is, I think, a key issue in these, because we actually do have a lot of legislation around that already. And I think this is a point I would like to make very, very strongly here, that we shouldn't misunderstand the AI Act to be the comprehensive legislation for artificial intelligence. It is one piece of a puzzle that contains, to me, an unknown number of pieces, actually. But we discover a new one every day and see what picture emerges. But on the issues you just mentioned, we have an EU anti-discrimination directive, for example. This is a very important piece of legislation, and you put that next to the GDPR, and you actually have, a fully fledged legislative framework for issues that you just mentioned, provided you actually know that those are issues. So that's where the transparency comes in, I think, very strongly. So that's been one of our focus areas. And then, of course, trying to learn, because for us, a big challenge is that we're talking about an emerging technology that's also evolving very dynamically. And we find that trying to find use cases in the federal government is useful to learn about impacts. We can have great abstract ideas about impact assessments and guidelines for the use of artificial intelligence, but through actually trying them out and using applications, I think we learn a lot more, and we can control them when we do them in our own shop. So that's why we find out that. Yeah.
Amazing. Well, I want to come to you, Chaitanya. We just launched the pilot of the National AI Research Resource. Hopefully, Congress also provides you with money to actually launch the full thing. That's hopefully. But until then, could you share the task force report talked a lot about the data side, that how NAIR will provide access to researchers for data and both to study responsible AI, to do research on that. Can you talk about how NAIR's role in providing access to government data to train AI models might also help the US government gain a better understanding of data governance?
Yeah, actually, in some sense, I want to reify that statement again. One of the things I want to say about NAIR is, at the end, I'm a computer scientist who does data, so I'm sort of a computer scientist, data scientist. And at the end of the day, and you heard this yesterday, even with the small language models, it's the data. That's what, of course, this meeting is about. But don't forget that it's all about the data. One of the, and now some of what I say is my opinion. As a senior advisor, I get to say what I think. You don't want to be you don't want to get distracted, let's say, with big hardware and the need for massive platforms. I'd actually argue that what you heard yesterday from SLM, for $5,000, you can train 1.5. I think maybe for $10,000, you could train 2.0, right? The small language models. It doesn't take much. Now, if you heard that carefully, you do need a large language model at the back because it's doing the synthetic generation data. Okay, so that's kind of like a supplier of data. So the question is, what is the research? What do you want NAIR to enable? Let's talk that way, right? So if you want NAIR to enable research in large language models, that's a rapidly moving target. You just heard that. I mean, it's moving so fast that we don't even know exactly what are we trying to do. But if you did want to do that kind of work, of course, you need these massive platforms. And we certainly have even companies like in our SBIR portfolio and in the TIP directorate, we tend to have now relationships with multiple sectors, including venture capital and so on. So when we've had our meetings with VCs, the VCs will tell us the first thing that a lot of these small companies are concerned about is lack of access to AI resources, meaning computing, right? So yes, all of that is there, but I think that's also evolving. But if you try to wait to assemble a massive platform, that's where you need your billions of dollars. Okay. There's a lot of work you can do without having to assemble massive platforms by just assembling data. So that's back to your question. So, and I like this idea of, so you clearly want to have very specific use cases from which you can understand, what's good, what's bad. And so you do what your shop understands. That's your point, right? Like what each agency. So one example I'll give you is, this is also about to come out from NSF. So we've had a working group, one of the working groups I've been on, which was talking about generative AI in NSF's context. Okay. NSF receives proposals, reviews proposals. Well, NSF writes solicitations, receives proposals, reviews them, receives annual reports and final reports, and that's the life cycle of sort of a proposal for NSF. And the discussion we had was, what's the role of generative AI in each of those cases? Okay, and there's going to be a directive going out. Can't say too much all the details of it, but basically addressing what is allowed and not allowed at each step of the process. Now, when I talk like this, I was at a conference saying this, and I had some industry folks around me, and they say, "You don't even know, it's already happening." I mean, you guys you don't even know what's happening. Okay, all right, maybe this is true, but that's why I say it's a moving target. So coming back to Nair, I think I would like to see Nair actually sequencing things a little bit. So sequencing the data issues, because you can work a lot on data without needing huge platforms. Okay. And then what you heard yesterday in the small language model discussion was there is a real sophistication about data that's emerging. Understanding what am I using for training? Where am I doing the curation? There was a lot of curation, what you heard yesterday. What am I curating? And if the data governance says you have to track all of these things, well, first you have to understand what are these things that people are doing to be able to say, you got to track this, you got to track that. And that's all data work. So that's my soapbox for the day is, it doesn't have to be thousands of GPUs to train these things, but you do need the data. So I think, like I gave you the NSF context, NSF could certainly understand in its context what would be the role of Gen AI, like the working group that we had. Similarly, I would think different agencies, USPDO, other federal agencies could all think about, okay, what would be the role of Gen AI in what I'm doing? And I think that's a good way to get started.
That's awesome. I want to and these with a rapid fire question for all of you, essentially. So this conference has focused on two problems related to data governance for AI. One, the enforcement problems for IP rights and personal data governance gaps, content providers, level of openness, etc. If you could recommend, whether it's just your personal view or, off the record, if you could recommend any policy related to the governance of data for LLMs, what would you suggest?
So I mentioned the Proto-OKN project, prototype of knowledge network. So a couple of projects in that cohort are looking at what we call the fabric, which is the technology stack. Right? They're using things like distributed ledger for tracking provenance, using notions of trustworthiness, which are user. I mean, so a user could say, I trust this data because it's coming from a NIST database. Right? But then the technology is how do you propagate that information through a query that you run, right? So I think those kind of technological approaches for tracking provenance and tracking the notion of trust, etc., would be important.
I would say, just following up on what you just said, I don't consider myself an expert in this area. I really have to say, but I've become very sensitive to the question that has emerged lately in the debate on the AI Act around how do we make sure to balance the interest of, those who want to develop these models and the interest of those whose data is being used for the development of those models, notably copyright holder. This is an area that has been quite sensitive now in the last, I would say, 2-3 months. The parliament has been the institution that has put that forward on paper, really, by indicating that providers of those models would need to publish a detailed summary of the data that's been used for. And after that proposal, everyone's complained. Both the providers of the models and the right holders basically complain, saying this is not enough or this is too much. So I don't have a final say. I do not know what will be the landing zone on this, but I'm very sensitive personally to this issue. And I think indeed, considering how these models are being developed and how indeed they can actually be fed on so much amount of information that indeed typically would be protected. I think it's important to ensure that indeed we find a fair balance here between, because I received so many complaints and papers by organizations, by right holders saying we risk going out of business in the next. I mean, I think if you're in their spot, it must be really threatening proposition. So I have no solution, but I really have to say the importance of ensuring that the data somehow we have tools to put in place to ensure that this a fair balance of interests is achieved.
Yeah, one thing I'd like to add to this. So another thing that I can't say too much about, but we hope very, very soon, we are putting out a program on responsible technology. Okay. And Trails has some of that aspect to it. So you'll see a call, and that's actually with foundations working with us. And it's all technologies. Initially, of course, everyone is worried about AI, but as I mentioned, Chips and Science Act actually talks about 10 technology areas that the TIC Directorate should be looking at. It includes things like biotech, smart manufacturing, quantum computing, all of that. There's a notion of what does it mean to be responsible in each of those. So the that's a program about to come out, but sorry, forgot the thing I was going to say. So you are the point. What was the point you just made?
About the balance between the right holders' interests and the interests of those.
Oh yes, sorry, thank you. What I wanted to say is, I'm now at a point where I don't think you should take these things as faith account. You shouldn't say, oh, large language models are here, that's it. Now we got to. I do think we have to get in there and say, no, what should the bounds be? Okay. Of course, understand in the U.S. government, the things are much more complicated and how you do this across the government. And maybe they're in EU, but I don't know individual European countries. But this notion that big tech is going to do it, and oh boy, we're just being subject to it. I think that needs to change, and hopefully, academia obviously has a huge role, and nonprofits huge role to play in that. And as TIP, we certainly are interested because one of the remits of TIP is impact on society, and its impact on all aspects of society, not just the high tech parts.
Want to close out?
Well, I agree very much with I call it the copyright issue. I think though that's a political one. It's always a nice answer from Burke. It requires political solution, yeah. But I do think that's the case here, really. Because it's not obvious. You have on the one hand, I think, well, we need to know a lot more about how data precisely is actually used in order to see, is this fair use or is this actually, copyrighted? This is not, I don't think it's very obvious. And, so I think it's both technically complex and politically complicated both. Regarding, yeah, the issues that you mentioned, I think I wouldn't suggest a policy at all. I think we have so many already that I would rather say we should invest a lot more resources in getting and understanding the interdependencies of policies we already have. I think the silo structures of governments are really not helpful in looking at, how does data protection, data use legislation, infrastructure investment, and then support, let's say, more business-oriented support structures for so technology diffusion actually interact. My second point that's also not a policy very explicitly is I think we need to rethink enforcement structures. I think there are really three things that we need to get a lot better at across all agencies, at least in my country. And please take this as a personal opinion now, because we're really bad at those right now. The first is I think we need much more systematic foresight. We deal with dynamic technologies, and that means we need structures that allow for very open but structured foresight community to come together and actually inform agencies in how to adapt. I think experimentation is important. This is what I thought of when, in the spirit of let's try things out, also inside the government, so that we actually learn something that might be of relevance for the overall economy and society. And then thirdly, other than the foresight and the experimentation, I think participation needs to get a lot better. So we need to widen access a lot more. And here I think we depend a lot on academia and civil society. And especially in civil society, our experience is that it's not always that easy to really find civil society organizations. There are not many that have deep technology knowledge. I think maybe we need to think a little bit about fostering the empowerment of civil society as well to actually develop that type of knowledge in depth and broadly both.
Amazing. I think with that, we'll take some questions from the audience. Yes.
Just have a request from the online audience if the speakers could bring the microphones closer to them.
Okay. Michael.
Michael Nelson with the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace here in Washington. I'm a technologist and a physicist, not a communications expert. But I've been struck by the fact that when we talk about machine learning, artificial intelligence, and particularly data, there is so much confusion. I've never seen a tech policy issue in 35 years. I've never seen a tech policy issue with more confusion, more bad models and memes that people have in their head. So my question is, for each of you, and including our moderator, what's the one myth or bumper sticker that is in the heads of the politicians that you would like to replace? For me, it's data is the new oil. And so I'd like to hear if you have a replacement for that one. A close runner-up is copyright. Reading copyrighted material is stealing. I think this idea that just using material for AI training is somehow stealing is crazy. But anyway, there's so many to choose from. What's your favorite or least favorite myth?
That's an easy one. AI will solve all our problems.
I'd go for AI is the new electricity. Yeah.
Yeah, I'll pass on this. I'm not sure I prefer not to. But I can say something on copyright, perhaps. I think the copyright, at least currently debate is about saying the tendency of politicians right now is to say, we do not want to reopen the copyright directive.
Yeah.
So in the EU, we have a copyright directive 2019. And apparently it's been a really very difficult file to close. And so now everyone's, both on the side of council and parliament, seems to agree we don't want to reopen the copyright directive, and we do not want to meddle in the AI Act with copyright issues either. And that's a bit of the problem. And so, because if we have today a problem, this problem I just discussed, how are we going to solve it? What the copyright directive says, we have in the use this text and data mining exception, which requires for copyright holders to opt out. The problem there, my understanding is that this is not always easily implemented. So therefore, the provider of this large language models may not necessarily know whether this opt-out has been expressed and whether the opt-out has been expressed in a machine readable form or not. So it sounds like, but again, I'm not an expert on this, that there is a question around enforcement there. And the tools that maybe should be indeed, as Michael was putting an emphasis on enforcement, or the tools that we have to focus sometimes really much more on implementing what we have, as opposed to just keep rushing behind the next hype and legislating something new. So for me, I don't understand why this directive that was adopted in 2019 and we still have apparently a struggle to implement this, what should be the solution? The fact that right holders can opt out, and this simply should be respected. As you say, if you take my content and I'm not authorized you to give it to you, it's not fair.
Reading is different than stealing. I mean, the equivalent model should be that these models are reading. Like I read and I write a paper and I put in a footnote. I acknowledge that I use somebody else's idea. That's not stealing.
I think it goes to that acknowledgement.
Michael, you're gonna need a pretty big bumper for that sticker.
Yeah.
I think. I didn't realize you were gonna put me on the spot. I'd say. I think there's a fallacy that we should not do X because do we really think China's gonna wait to put guardrails? In fact, the point is they have to. They have to put even stronger guardrails because they cannot afford for a large language model to be critical of the CCP.
Yes.
Yeah, so this one probably more for Gabrielle and I will say like getting the TDM right is just like let's work on that. That would be great. So we're seeing an AI office that's going to have a role in shaping how things are implemented, and we're seeing like we're starting to get there with the standards work. And it's work that's not always very visible for public society or academics or open advocates to get involved in. What would be your recommendations for people to manage to get involved, bring the other perspective into that process, and see how it can work for everyone?
The AI office, you mean, in general?
And the standard building that's going to follow the AI.
Definitely for the standard building, I mean, that's part of the process, and the European standardization regulation foresees the fact that everyone can participate in the process of standard setting. It is true, and this is part of the criticism that has been sometimes raised, that corporate actors have better way to participate in that process compared to others. But the regulation itself foresees the possibility also for the Commission to actually give specific financing for also other entities to be part of the process. Indeed, as also Michael was saying, I mean, this must be an inclusive process. And we cannot just rely, especially, regardless of whether the NLF is a good approach or not for AI, as it has been contested. But I also want to say that the standardization system in the EU allows for actors that are not corporate actors to be part of the process. So there is perhaps more work to be done. So how do we ensure that? But it's part of the system. It's not that, because this is a technical issue, only corporate actors can do it. No, I think it doesn't mean that because it's technical standards, civil society should not participate. And I'm sure there are a lot of civil society organizations that indeed have technical expertise as well to contribute. So there should be a way for them to be part of that process as well. So I'm not following myself directly our work on standardization, but I know that this is foreseen in the legal framework, and therefore there must be ways for the Commission to be encouraged indeed to facilitate that to happen in practice.
Susan.
Just to say, we've gotten some online audience people have asked everyone to speak louder. Okay. So I want to summarize what I heard. We need to be more anticipatory.
You're not louder, Susan.
Okay. Can you hear me now? So here's what I've heard. We need to be more anticipatory, but we need to do a better job of enforcement. We need to involve the public more. But we don't, but we're going to involve civil society, which is not the public. We need to educate the public, civil society, which is not the public. We, current, laws are not, sufficient to deal with these problems, but they're enforcement problems. So there's a lot of contradictions here, right? And part of the problem is maybe that on one hand, you guys have said these laws are out of date, but perhaps we shouldn't change those laws because the technology is constantly changing. So I'm just going to ask one aspect of it, because Adam and I did a paper that looked at AI strategies. And I think of 43 countries that had an AI strategy, like four consulted their public and acknowledged that consultation. I think none of them did anything to change their policies in response, their AI strategy. And it was of all the nations at the OECD. Did I have that right, Adam? Summarize that right? Because the paper was a while ago.
Germany did acknowledge that areas where they changed the AI strategy based on public feedback, but there was a very small number of countries that did that.
Yeah.
Can I just say, I actually organized that, so
That's what I want to ask you about. Like,
what we did, I mean, we had major public consultation there. But I think you also have to acknowledge that what happens when, as a government, you start a public consultation, what you get back is from organizations that represent parts of the public.
right.
You know, this is what you get back. You know, so that of course I think also is idiosyncratic to our country, in the sense that we had a lot of social partner engagement, which of course is that's a very German thing, right? So there was a lot there. And then also something that I would say is like the para social partners, sort of that can be associations that are mostly active in civil rights and social affairs, that have some tie in with social partner structures as well, right? So they are sufficiently resourced to actually, you know, take the time to read the text, comment on it, and of course our idea was that we'd hope that they represent certain parts, you know, of the population. And the range, really, just to give you an idea here, was from an association representing people with disability to a classical civil rights organization focusing on anti-racism work and gender parity. So that there were you know, that's not all the I say this it's not all the same. Yeah. So you actually do get quite a wide range. And yes, we did, in effect. And I also think that what we saw is that we do have very open processes, but I would also say that the feedback that we got was that while a lot of, and again, yes, I am talking about civil society organizations, because an individual, I mean, I can speak about another project where we had an outreach to the wider public as well. But it's difficult to get a bi-directional exchange actually going, a true exchange, when you focus on the broad public. And I also think I'm not sure whether many governments are ready to give the resources that are necessary to do that successfully.
So that's my question. How do you do it so that it becomes a civics issue? And this is the public interest technology question, and it is embedded in Trails. Like, we at Trails have tried to educate high school students and you know, groups that are marginalized, we try to involve them in every phase of the process. But ultimately, unless you educate people to the stakes, and who should do that so that you hear what the public is concerned about, and maybe that helps you anticipate? How do you do that? Thank you.
What I found, I'm going to use an example from another, because, you know, I don't think there's, first of all, I don't think there's a silver bullet. I can just say, like, from my experience, things that have worked better than others. What I found very fruitful, and this is an anecdote and just a personal opinion, but we had a very large consultation process that related to a lot of the aspects we're discussing here, with a focus on the workplace. So, you know, it was under the heading of Future of Work. You may be familiar with the Industry 4.0 paradigm in Germany. We also developed a Work 4.0 idea, and We did one, I think, pretty standard thing that was a big online consultation that had something like 25,000 responses from individuals. That was a bit gamified, and that one could look at how one's own preferences about the workplace would map to, let's say, a survey that we used to map past and present preferences about workplace structures, things that you also have in the AI debate here, working time reduction, productivity, how to divide productivity gains, etc. But then we also organized a film festival with documentaries so 5 documentaries, each from a different decade, about the future of work. And the festival was always organized along the same structure, where over 5 days, each evening, you would have one of those documentaries shown in a local cinema, followed by a discussion, a local stakeholder discussion after each of those movies was shown. And that toured 25 cities in Germany. So we had 125 events with that, right? And they were very different in size. I think the smallest one was around 50 participants, in a very small sort of neighborhood cinema, and then we also had larger ones. But I found that a very fruitful endeavor. We tried. We didn't actually even accompany each of those events, but some. And it was always very interesting to see those discussions getting kickstarted and the kind of people that would participate, because it was really, really diverse set of people. So I think those type of outreach activities are possible, but what I also noticed is it was extremely resource intensive to try and get a kind of systematic feedback. And I say kind of, because, well, I'd say we approached systematic feedback, but didn't actually get there. Because, we had to hire people that did nothing but travel along and, try and pay attention to what people were saying, and then trying to actually summarize that in such a way that we get some feedback from that. But yeah, so I do think there are ways, but this is really, really resource intensive. I mean, we spend several million euros just on that. That's not realistic for every policy project in every policy area.
So Susan, your question reminds me of sometime back, I was contacted by Dan Fay, who's at Microsoft Research. Some of you might know. And Microsoft was running a workshop, which I think by now should have been held, bringing together social media influencers and telling them how they can exploit the latest AI, right? Because AI is actually disrupting the world of social media influencers. So you want to talk about influence, you bring people like that together. Talk to the social media influencers. I'm serious. Yeah.
Amazing. Any other questions? Yes. Oh, you have the mic. Sure, done there.
Here, Michael. Oh, yeah. Thank you. Thank you. Thanks for this panel. I can actually talk a little bit about civic engagement. So I've been supporting the Modernization Committee in Congress for the last 5 years, and about 8 of the recommendations involved how do you use technology to improve constituent engagement. And I actually just finished a week of field research in district offices where we're trying to embed the engagement into constituent relations. So it's in the workflow, and it's not yet another, what I call sort of performance arena for members. Town halls have become dangerous and completely unproductive. Every member office controls their own data. Congress just got a digital service 3 years ago. The separation of powers in the Constitution limits data sharing between the executive branch and Congress. And the right to petition function in the First Amendment, which should belong functionally in the House of Representatives, was basically abandoned in the 40s. So at every level, the connection between at least the US Congress and the American public has been sort of tattered or a derelict, left derelict, or abandoned. And so this question is key because our social cohesion problem is dangerous at this point. But a lot of what I hear from district facing staff, and keep in mind that they have 18 staff and it's never changed. So members of Congress started with 30,000. Now they have 780,000 constituents. And unless we use technology to scale participation and sort of the legitimacy functions, not only the data improvement functions, we can't keep up. And Congress also abandoned its foresight capacity in 1995. It wiped out a lot of it, a third of its committee staff. The sort of social cohesion and situational awareness people inside the institution are gone. So bringing that back in is also really important. But there's a huge appetite for connecting to real people, authenticating it, and getting that kind of data in as an advisory resource in lawmaking. So one of the ways to do this, I think, is to create a civic voice or a community data trust in the Library of Congress, where members can curate information from their own constituents. But right now, there's just no feedback there that's useful. We don't have a monitoring evaluation function. It's how you like who you rode up the elevator with or had lunch with. There's really no systematic way to do this, although the options are there now. And it's this modernization committee, 202 recommendations. I can't recommend it enough. This is the House side, not the Senate side, although you can mention the Senate's waiting for its messenger pigeons to die. Sorry, that they're making baby steps, but the House is probably 10 to 15 years ahead of the Senate at this point on tech. My question for you is like, how are you creating sort of a whole of government approach with the data advances in the executive branches so that the legislative branch is using it? You all have parliamentary systems far easier in a lot of ways than Congress because it's this sort of mixtape of representation. And there's real rules about how even the branches communicate with each other. But the whole data of democracy exists in the first branch. And it's almost impossible. It's either, like we talked about yesterday, it's yellow sticky notes, shoe boxes in the basement of Congress, and PDFs that you can't find. And Congress has funded the executive branch billions of dollars to get good at data with the Data Act and all kinds of money. And it just will not spend money on itself to bring itself up to par, to be able to participate in this world of, evolution of data technology and public interest. So I'd like to know how you're sharing with your legislatures, because I feel like that's always left out. And we're asking them to regulate. The way they're going to regulate AI and everything else is start to use it themselves. They don't know what we're talking about when we say these things. And you're lucky if your intern was a computer science major. There's actually an experiment. There is AI being used right now in Congress on comparative prints of legislation to track amendments. Tiny baby steps, but it's only going to be really basic stuff that we use inside. But it's not going to be able to regulate this until it understands what it is. So I'd like to know, like, are there plans between the European Parliament is closer to Congress than any nation state in Europe?
I mean, I cannot speak for the Parliament now. I mean, to my understanding, at least when it comes to, let's say, sharing of data information between the institutions in the EU, I'm not aware of tools or mechanisms that we're using, except basically the fact that we typically talk to the same people. So we have, the commission, of course, any document it produces, or the proposals, or the preparatory work on the proposal, which, by the way, involves extensive consultations by its principle, by its nature. So we have the so-called beta regulation approach, whereby every single time we want to, engage with a proposal, we first produce an inception impact assessment, an impact assessment, where indeed the public can engage. In the case of the AI Act, we even produced a white paper. So it was in 2020. So even before, actually, we knew we had a political mandate to propose legislation on AI when the von der Leyen Commission came into office. But we were not that much advanced. So the first step we did was to develop a white paper, which is a kind of a way for the Commission to really engage a wider consultation before actually, start writing the actual legislation. And that was actually a very successful exercise. We were overwhelmed with feedback from all over the world, but also from all sorts of constituencies. And certainly that was very helpful for us we took that in, and then we integrated into the thought process for the AI Act. But then indeed, in terms of how do we share information between the three actors of the legislative process, that I'm not aware of any particular tool, except the fact that indeed basically all our work is public, so we can engage with each other. And indeed, I know the people who talk to me will talk also to the rapporteurs in the parliament, will talk to the digital attaches in the member states. So typically we always engage with the same type of constituencies. So I would assume we are on an equal level, playing field in terms of knowledge, access to information.
Amazing. One last question, and then we'll wrap up.
Is it okay? Good. Question for you, Dr. Baru, NSF. So I'm working on multilingual natural language processing for indigenous languages. And I'm curious, have you seen any good models in working with tribes because in the United States, they are federally recognized. It's heterogeneous. You have state recognized, federally recognized, and then you have tribal corporations like in Alaska. Have you seen much good policy around data governance with working with these heterogeneous tribal environments with NSF grants?
Well, no, I haven't. Part of it has to do with the notion that in the overall population of stuff that we do, that's a smaller population, obviously. The program that I talked about that might be coming out shortly about responsible technologies specifically calls out tribal communities as one that we want to engage. So at least as far as TIP is concerned, TIP's mandate says that we should actively and proactively look at populations that are impacted. And so that, that could be a broad remit. I would have to go back and check if we have done projects, whether through computer science or other parts of NSF, that have specifically looked at language models and language processing, etc. For there used to be a program on that. I don't know if you remember this. So someone, I've been at NSF 6 years, but I've been an NSF PI for 25 years. But there was a small program at NSF once, which was about rescuing languages. And so we'll have to check, what has been done. Yeah, please do. Yeah.
I think I can share a bit more on that. Like outside of NSF, DARPA has a couple of projects on low resource languages. One of them is called Lorelei, which so it's a they don't just make killer robots. But I think this was a great panel. Thank you, everyone. We'll pray for your colleagues in Brussels. So if there's any lesson you can take from the US, it is that no matter how tough the negotiations are, you always have a bill before Christmas.